The year is 1500, and the world is a dark, fractured puzzle held together by fear and superstition. To the people of the 16th century, the horizon was not a destination. It was a physical wall, a terrifying boundary where the known world ended and the nightmare began. Maps of this era were filled with empty spaces, decorated only with illustrations of krakens, sea serpents, and warnings of "Here be dragons." It was believed that the Atlantic was a sea of darkness, a place where the sun boiled the water and the air turned into a thick, poisonous fog that would melt the lungs of any man brave enough to breathe it. Yet, in the face of this absolute terror, a strange fever began to grip the heart of Europe. It wasn't a fever of bravery, but a fever of desperation. Europe was a continent under siege, choked by the Ottoman Empire's control of the Silk Road. The gold was gone, the silk was rare, and spices, the black pepper and cinnamon that the kings craved, were more expensive than human life. This was the spark that lit the flame of the Age of Discovery. It was a time when men decided that the risk of a gruesome death at sea was better than the certainty of poverty on land. When you look at the massive wooden galleons of the 1500s, you aren't looking at masterpieces of engineering, you are looking at floating coffins. To step onto one of these ships was to sign your own death warrant. The sailors who manned these expeditions were the outcasts, the desperate, and the mad. Life on board was a slow descent into hell. Hundreds of men were packed into spaces so tight they could barely breathe, living alongside rats and livestock. Within weeks of leaving the harbor, the fresh water would turn into a thick, green slime filled with larvae. The hard biscuits, their only source of food, became infested with weevils that sailors eventually learned to eat in the dark so they wouldn't have to see what was moving in their mouths. Then came the Dutch death, scurvy. This wasn't just a disease, it was a horror movie. A man's body would literally begin to fall apart. Old scars from childhood would split open, teeth would drop out of rotting gums, and bones that had broken years ago would suddenly snap again as the connective tissue dissolved. More men were buried in the cold, nameless depths of the ocean than were ever killed by enemy cannons. Yet the ships kept sailing west and south, driven by a singular, obsessive ghost, the promise of El Dorado, the city of gold. The encounter between the old world and the new was not a peaceful meeting. It was a violent collision of two realities that had never imagined each other's existence. Imagine the scene from the shore of a Caribbean island. A group of people who have lived in harmony with the sea for millennia suddenly see a mountain of wood and white cloth rising from the waves. Men with skin the color of ash, covered in shining metal scales that no arrow could pierce, stepped onto the sand carrying wooden sticks that could summon thunder and fire. To the natives, these were gods or demons. To the Europeans, these people were merely obstacles standing between them and the gold they believed was hidden in every river and mountain. The discovery of the Americas sparked a global gold rush that drenched the soil in blood. It was a period of history defined by a terrifying contradiction. On one hand, the incredible human spirit of exploration and the courage to face the unknown. On the other, an insatiable greed that led to the systematic destruction of entire civilizations. The treasures sent back to the kings of Spain and Portugal didn't just build palaces. They funded a new era of global warfare. As the 16th century progressed, the ocean became the ultimate battlefield. Every ship that left Lisbon or Seville was a gamble for global supremacy. The maps were being redrawn every month, and with every new line drawn in ink, 1,000 lives were lost in the salt water. This was an era where the lines between explorer, pirate, and conqueror were blurred into one. Men like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama weren't just sailors. They were the architects of a new world order that would prioritize trade and empire over everything else. The Atlantic Ocean, once a barrier of myth, had become a highway of misery and wealth. Underneath the beautiful blue waves of the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans lie the remains of thousands of these wooden titans, filled with the bones of men who never saw their homes again. They died for a handful of spices, a bar of gold, or the simple, ego-driven desire to see what lay beyond the curve of the earth. This was the beginning of the modern world, born in the dark, fueled by the cold winds of the ocean, and built upon the ruins of the unknown. The Age of Discovery taught humanity that the world is vast, But it also proved that the most dangerous thing on the planet isn't the sea monster in the depths, but the ambition in a man's heart. The journey across the Atlantic was a descent into a world where time and direction lost all meaning. As the wooden hulls groaned under the relentless pressure of the open sea, the sailors found themselves trapped in a psychological void. The vastness of the ocean was not just a physical distance, it was a mental weight that crushed the spirits of even the most hardened men. By the time a ship reached the middle of the Atlantic, the familiar stars of the northern hemisphere had begun to sink behind them, replaced by strange, unfamiliar constellations that offered no guidance. This was the moment where the fear of the unknown turned into a cold, paralyzing reality. The compasses of the time were primitive, often failing as they neared magnetic anomalies, leaving captains to navigate by instinct and prayer. The silence of the deep ocean was broken only by the screams of the wind in the rigging and the occasional, terrifying sound of a whale breaching near the ship, a sight that many sailors mistook for the literal monsters of legend. In this isolation, the hierarchy of the ship became the only thing keeping the men from total madness. The captain's word was law, enforced with brutal discipline. A single act of disobedience could result in a man being lashed until the bones showed, or worse, being marooned on a barren rock in the middle of nowhere. But even the threat of death could not stop the spreading rot of mutiny when the food ran out. The stowage areas of the ship, meant to hold enough supplies for months, became breeding grounds for filth. The smell of rotting wood, stale urine, and stagnant water became the permanent atmosphere of the voyage. To cope, men turned to superstition. They told stories of ghost ships like the Flying Dutchman, cursed to sail the seas forever without ever reaching port. They began to see omens in everything, the flight of a bird, the color of the sunset, or the way the dolphins trailed the ship. Every sunrise was a miracle, and every sunset was a funeral for another day spent in the green desert of the sea. When land was finally sighted, it was often by accident rather than design. The first cry of "Land ho!" from the crow's nest did not bring joy so much as a collective sense of shock. The land they encountered was not the civilized, gold-paved streets of Sepanga or the spice markets of India they had been promised. Instead, they found rugged coastlines and dense, impenetrable jungles that hummed with the sounds of thousands of unknown insects. The air was thick with a humidity that felt like a physical weight, and the scents were overpowering: wild orchids, rotting vegetation, and wood smoke. As the men rowed their small boats toward the shore, they were watched by eyes they could not see. The indigenous peoples, who had lived in these lands for over 10,000 years, saw these arrivals not as explorers, but as strange, sickly invaders from another dimension. This was the true edge of the world. The conquest that followed was a whirlwind of steel and disease. The Europeans brought with them more than just swords and crosses. They brought invisible killers. Smallpox, measles, and influenza traveled faster than any soldier, wiping out entire villages before a single shot was ever fired. In the great cities of the Aztecs and the Incas, the arrival of the white men was seen as the fulfillment of dark prophecies. The gold that the Europeans craved, the sweat of the sun, was stripped from the walls of temples and melted into bars to be shipped back to the vaults of Madrid. This was the great irony of the Age of Discovery. In their search for the origins of life and the fountains of youth, the explorers instead brought an era of unprecedented death. The riches of the New World did not bring peace to Europe. They fueled centuries of religious wars and imperial rivalries that would eventually consume the globe. By the end of this first great expansion, the map of the world had been violently torn apart and stitched back together. The ocean was no longer a mystery, but a highway for the greatest forced migration in human history. The silver mines of Potosí and the sugar plantations of the Caribbean became the new engines of the global economy, built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. The legacy of the 16th century is etched into every coastline and every border we see today. It was a century that proved man could conquer the earth, but it also raised a haunting question that still lingers: at what cost? As the sun set on the first century of discovery, the world was smaller, more connected, and infinitely more scarred. The age of myth was over, and the age of empire had truly begun. As the mid-16th century dawned, the ocean had ceased to be a barrier and had become a vast, blue cemetery for the ambitious. The initial shock of discovery had worn off, replaced by a cold, calculated hunger for total domination. This was the era of the conquistadors, men who were neither soldiers nor explorers in the traditional sense, but private contractors of destruction. They moved through the dense, suffocating jungles of Central and South America like ironclad ghosts, their heavy armor rusting in the humid heat, their minds obsessed with a single word, El Dorado. The legend of a city made entirely of gold drove them into the heart of darkness, where they faced terrors that no map could have prepared them for. They encountered rivers that ran for thousands of miles, forests where the canopy was so thick that the sun never touched the ground, and tribes who fought with poisoned arrows that brought a slow, screaming death. Every step inland was a step away from civilization and a step closer to the primal ferocity of a world that did not want to be found. The psychological toll on these men was immense. Far from the courts of Europe, the thin veil of morality began to tear. In the absence of law, the strongest and most ruthless rose to power, leading to internal betrayals that were often more violent than the battles with the natives. Mutiny was a constant shadow. Brothers turned against brothers over a single gold ornament. This period saw the rise of the Black Legend, a reputation for cruelty that would define the European presence in the Americas for centuries. The search for gold became a religious crusade in their minds, a divine right to take whatever they could grasp. They didn't just want the wealth of the land, they wanted to erase the memory of what had been there before. Temples that had stood for 1,000 years were torn down stone by stone, their sacred carvings smashed to provide the foundations for colonial churches. The cultural genocide was as swift as it was silent, as the oral histories of millions were extinguished in the smoke of burning libraries and the silence of empty cities. On the water, the nature of the voyage had changed from exploration to a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The Spanish Main became the world's most dangerous shipping lane. Massive treasure fleets, laden with silver from the mines of the Andes, began their treacherous journey back to Europe. These ships were slow, heavy, and vulnerable, making them the ultimate targets for a new breed of predator, the privateer. Backed by the crowns of England, France, and the Netherlands, these state-sponsored pirates turned the Atlantic into a zone of constant, undeclared warfare. This was the age of the great naval duel, where massive wooden ships traded broadsides in the middle of the ocean, the air filled with the smell of sulfur and the splintering of oak. To be a sailor in this era was to live in a state of perpetual combat, either against the elements or against the cannons of a rival nation. The wealth of the New World was literally sinking to the bottom of the sea, one shipwreck at a time. Behind the smoke and the steel lay a deeper, more sinister transformation of the earth itself. This was the beginning of the Columbian Exchange, a biological revolution that changed the very chemistry of the planet. While gold flowed east, plants, animals, and pathogens flowed west. Horses, pigs, and cattle were introduced to the American plains, forever altering the landscape and the way of life for the surviving indigenous populations. In return, crops like potatoes, corn, and tomatoes reached Europe and Asia, eventually fueling a population boom that would provide the manpower for future industrial revolutions. But this exchange was paved with human suffering. As the native labor force collapsed under the weight of European diseases and overwork, the colonizers turned their eyes toward Africa. The transatlantic slave trade began as a trickle in the 16th century, a solution to a labor shortage that would grow into a tidal wave of human misery, creating a legacy of trauma that would shape the destiny of 3 continents. As Part 3 draws to a close, the world is no longer a collection of isolated islands of humanity. It is becoming a single, interconnected web, tied together by the wake of sailing ships and the greed of kings. The 16th century had stripped the world of its mystery and replaced it with a price tag. The map was now a grid of property, and the oceans were the veins through which the lifeblood of the global economy, silver and human sweat, began to flow. The dream of a peaceful new world had vanished, replaced by the reality of a global empire that never slept. The explorers had become conquerors, and the conquerors were now becoming administrators of a vast, bleeding machine. The horizon was no longer a place of wonder. It was the edge of an ever-expanding border, and the true cost of this new world was only just beginning to be realized by those who lived in its long, dark shadow. By the time the mid-1500s transitioned into the latter half of the century, the world was no longer just being explored. It was being exploited on a scale that defied human imagination. The initial wonder of seeing a new coast had been replaced by the cold, mechanical efficiency of the colonial machine. In the heart of the South American continent, at a place called Potosí, the Spanish discovered a mountain made almost entirely of silver. This rich hill became the dark heart of the global economy, a place where the earth was hollowed out by hundreds of thousands of indigenous laborers and, eventually, enslaved Africans. The conditions inside these mines were a literal vision of hell. Men worked in total darkness, breathing in toxic dust and mercury fumes, often not seeing the sun for weeks at a time. The silver pulled from these depths didn't just fill the coffers of Spain. It traveled across the Pacific to the Philippines and into China, creating the first truly global currency. The world was now tethered together by a silver chain, and every link in that chain was forged in human suffering. While the mines bled the land dry, the oceans became the stage for an even more complex and deadly game of global chess. The arrival of the galleon trade meant that the world was now a circular loop of commerce. Ships were no longer just carrying men, they were carrying ecosystems. This was the era of the great maritime superpowers, where a single storm or a single naval defeat could bankrupt an entire kingdom. The English, long considered a backwater nation of sea dogs, began to challenge the Spanish monopoly with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Men like Francis Drake were celebrated as heroes in London and cursed as demons in Madrid. They circumnavigated the globe not just to see the world, but to burn Spanish ports and plunder treasure ships. These voyages were feats of incredible endurance, lasting years at a time, where sailors forgot the sound of birds and the smell of grass, becoming as wild and salt-crusted as the ships they sailed. This period also marked the beginning of the fortress era. To protect their stolen wealth, European powers began building massive stone fortifications across the Caribbean, the coast of Africa, and the edges of Asia. These were not just military outposts, they were the foundations of a new type of society based on exclusion and surveillance. The native populations found themselves living as strangers in their own lands, forced to speak new languages and bow to a new god. The spiritual conquest was as total as the military one. Priests followed the soldiers, carrying crosses that were often as sharp as the swords that preceded them. They sought to save souls by erasing thousands of years of indigenous knowledge, burning the sacred codices of the Maya and the Aztecs, and replacing ancient rituals with the ironclad doctrines of the Inquisition. The psychological landscape of the world was being flattened, turned into a mirror of European thought. However, the land itself began to fight back in subtle, biological ways. The Columbian Exchange was now in full swing, but it brought with it unintended consequences that would haunt the colonizers. While the Europeans brought smallpox to the Americas, they took back something equally devastating: syphilis. The Great Pox spread through the courts and brothels of Europe like wildfire, a silent reminder that the conquest of a new world came with a physical price. Furthermore, the massive deforestation required to build armadas of wooden ships began to change the climate of Europe and the colonies. Forests that had stood since the Roman era were leveled in decades. The thirst for timber was as insatiable as the thirst for gold, leading to the first signs of large-scale environmental collapse. The world was being consumed, piece by piece, to feed the furnace of early capitalism. As Part 4 concludes, the map of the world is no longer a work of art, it is a ledger of assets. The great empires of the East, like the Ming Dynasty and the Mughal Empire, were beginning to feel the ripples of this Atlantic explosion. The silver flowing out of the Americas was destabilizing economies thousands of miles away. No corner of the earth was safe from the reach of the wooden ships and the men who sailed them. The age of the lone explorer was dead, replaced by the age of the chartered company, entities like the Dutch East India Company that had the power to wage war, coin money, and execute prisoners. The individual human spirit was being swallowed by the corporate and imperial machine. The horizon was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a market to be captured, and the true horror of the 16th century was the realization that there was nowhere left to hide. As the 1500s surged into their final decades, the world entered a phase of brutal maturity. The chaotic, scattered voyages of the past had solidified into a permanent, iron-fisted infrastructure of global trade and suffering. This was the era where the plantation system was perfected, a dark invention that would scar the human story forever. In the Caribbean and along the coast of Brazil, the green gold of sugar began to rival the white silver of the mines. Sugar was a crop that demanded blood. It required a level of backbreaking labor that the decimated indigenous populations could no longer provide. To fill this void, the European powers turned the Atlantic into a conveyor belt of human souls. The Middle Passage became a journey of unimaginable horror, where millions of Africans were chained in the darkness of ship holds, treated as mere cargo in a global ledger. Those who survived the crossing were thrust into a world where they were no longer humans, but fuel for the machines of the New World. The wealth generated by this misery began to transform the very architecture of Europe. Cities like London, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, which had once been modest trading posts, were rebuilt with stone and marble, their streets paved with the profits of the overseas colonies. But this wealth was a double-edged sword. The massive influx of American silver triggered the price revolution, a period of hyperinflation that shattered the lives of the European working class. While the kings and merchants grew obscenely rich, the common man found that a loaf of bread now cost 10 times what it did in his father's time. The global economy was growing, but it was growing unevenly, creating a chasm between the elite and the masses that would eventually spark centuries of revolution. The world was now a place where a decision made in a counting house in Madrid could cause a famine in a village in France, or a massacre in a kingdom in West Africa. Technologically, the 16th century was ending with a terrifying advancement in the art of destruction. Ships were no longer just transport vessels. They were floating fortresses, bristling with bronze and iron cannons that could level a coastal city in an afternoon. Naval warfare became a science of geometry and gunpowder. This was the age of the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet of 130 ships sent to crush the rising power of England. The clash was not just a battle between two nations, but a collision of two different philosophies of the world. The defeat of the Armada in 1588 was a turning point in history, signaling the slow decline of the Mediterranean powers and the rise of the Atlantic giants. The sea was no longer a place of mystery. It was a highway of steel, and the nation that controlled the waves controlled the destiny of the planet. In the shadows of this global conflict, the first true scientific revolution was quietly beginning. The explorers had returned with plants, animals, and maps that contradicted everything the ancient Greeks and the Church had taught. The sheer volume of new information was breaking the old intellectual structures of Europe. It was no longer enough to rely on ancient texts. Men had to see for themselves. This new, empirical mindset, the need for observation and proof, was a direct byproduct of the voyages of discovery. The telescope and the microscope were on the horizon, born from the same restless curiosity that had driven Magellan and Columbus. But this new knowledge was often used for control. Maps became state secrets, more valuable than gold, as kingdoms realized that to know the shape of the world was to possess the power to rule it. As Part 5 draws to a close, a heavy, somber atmosphere settles over the globe. The 16th century had begun with the hope of reaching the East and finding paradise, but it was ending with the reality of a world carved up by greed and steel. The great civilizations of the Americas were now ghost stories, their languages fading as their children were forced into the culture of their conquerors. The ocean, once an infinite mystery, was now a crisscross of established trade routes, patrolled by warships and stained with the blood of the enslaved and the sailors alike. The world was now one, but it was a unity forged in chains and fire. The horizon was no longer a place of dreams. It was a border to be defended, and the true life story of this era was the realization that humanity's greatest discovery was its own capacity for organized, global-scale cruelty. The dawn of the final decade of the 16th century brought with it a shift from the physical conquest of land to the total conquest of the human mind and spirit. The world was now a laboratory of power, and the European empires were beginning to experiment with the first forms of global propaganda. In the courts of London, Paris, and Madrid, the stories of the New World were no longer just tales of adventure. They were carefully crafted narratives designed to justify the ongoing expansion. This was the era of the great mapmakers, men like Mercator, who began to flatten the round earth onto paper. By choosing what to emphasize and what to shrink, these cartographers were not just drawing geography. They were drawing the hierarchy of the world. Europe was placed at the center, appearing larger and more dominant than the continents it was plundering. The very way humanity perceived the planet was being engineered to favor the conquerors, creating a psychological map that would persist for centuries. Deep within the colonies, the resistance of the earth took a new, more terrifying form, the emergence of maroon societies. In the mountains of Jamaica, the forests of Brazil, and the swamps of Florida, those who had escaped the chains of slavery and the brutality of the mines began to build their own hidden civilizations. These were the true, new worlds, clandestine societies that blended African, indigenous, and even European traditions into something entirely new. They lived in a state of perpetual guerrilla warfare against the colonial authorities, proving that despite the massive machinery of the empire, the human desire for freedom could never be fully extinguished. These hidden pockets of resistance became legends, whispered among the enslaved in the fields, serving as a reminder that the land still belonged to those who bled for it, not just those who held the titles. On the high seas, the nature of the sailor's life had evolved into a grim, professionalized misery. The romanticism of the early voyages had long since vanished. The Atlantic was now a highway of heavy traffic, governed by strict maritime laws and the brutal rhythm of the trade winds. The press gangs became a common sight in European port cities, kidnapping young men and forcing them into a lifetime of service on warships. These men became a new class of global citizens, proletarians of the sea who had more in common with their enemies on other ships than with the kings they served. They developed their own languages, their own codes of conduct, and their own dark folklore. The ocean was no longer a place of monsters, but a place of labor, where the constant threat of the lash or the hangman's noose was more real than any sea serpent. As the century neared its end, the first signs of the Great Dying became an undeniable reality. The population of the Americas, which some historians estimate was as high as 60 million before Columbus, had plummeted by nearly 90%. This was a demographic collapse of such magnitude that it actually altered the Earth's atmosphere. As millions of farmers perished, the forests and wilderness reclaimed the abandoned fields. The massive regrowth of trees pulled so much carbon dioxide from the air that it contributed to the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that caused crop failures and freezing winters back in Europe. The conquest had reached such a scale that it was now affecting the very climate of the planet. The blood of the New World was literally cooling the air of the Old World. As Part 6 concludes, the transition from the 16th to the 17th century is marked by a sense of exhaustion and cold calculation. The wild, chaotic energy of the Age of Discovery has been tamed and turned into a system of bureaucracy and taxes. The world is now a giant machine of extraction, fueled by the silver of Potosí, the sugar of the Caribbean, and the lives of the millions who work the soil. The horizon is no longer a mystery, it is a ledger. The great wooden ships are no longer symbols of hope, but the iron bars of a global cage. The story of the world has become a story of who owns the water and who owns the wind. The stage is now set for the final act, where the global empires will turn their sights on the last remaining corners of the map, and the struggle for the soul of the planet will reach its breaking point. The final decade of the 16th century closes like a heavy iron gate, signaling the end of the Age of Discovery and the birth of the Age of Empire. The world that had once seemed infinite, mysterious, and terrifying was now mapped, measured, and owned. The great wooden ships, which had first set out as fragile vessels of hope, were now the enforcers of a global order that favored the few at the expense of the many. By the year 1600, the Pran Kahini of this era had reached its climax. The primary focus of the world's powers had shifted from finding new lands to securing the trade routes of death. The Pacific, once a vast and lonely expanse, was now traversed by the Manila galleons, completing the first truly global circuit of capital. For the first time in human history, An event in a marketplace in China could cause a riot in the streets of London, or a change in the price of silver in Peru could collapse a dynasty in Asia. The world had become a single, vibrating web of greed and exchange. In this final phase, the spiritual and intellectual landscape of humanity was permanently altered. The old myths of sea monsters and boiling oceans had been replaced by something far more chilling: the cold, hard science of navigation and the bureaucratic reality of the chartered company. The founding of the East India Company in 1600 marked the moment where the individual explorer was replaced by the faceless corporation. These entities were granted the power to raise armies, execute prisoners, and govern vast territories, all in the name of profit. The individual human spirit, which had driven men like Magellan to face the unknown, was now a cog in a massive, profit-driven machine. The era of the hero was over. The era of the administrator had begun. The world was no longer a place to be wondered at, but a resource to be managed. The legacy of the 16th century was a world divided by the Great Divergence. While the capitals of Europe shone with stolen gold and the fruits of global trade, the rest of the world bore the scars of the encounter. The Americas remained a landscape of ghosts, where the silence of abandoned cities was a haunting reminder of the civilizations that had been erased. In Africa, the social fabric of entire nations had been torn apart to feed the insatiable hunger of the Atlantic slave trade. Even the environment itself had been forced to submit. The earth was scarred by deep mines, its forests leveled for timber, and its oceans patrolled by the ironclad resolve of competing armadas. The biological makeup of the planet had been homogenized, as foreign plants and animals replaced native species, creating a new Pangea that served European tastes. Yet, as the sun set on this century, a new kind of human consciousness was emerging from the wreckage. The collision of cultures, however violent, had forced humanity to look at itself in a mirror. Philosophers began to question the nature of civilization and savagery, and the first seeds of international law were sown as scholars debated whether the people of the New World had rights that even kings must respect. The global exchange of ideas, though often forced, led to a cross-pollination of knowledge that would eventually spark the Enlightenment. The world was now small enough to be understood, but it had become complex enough to be dangerous. The mystery of the horizon had been solved, but the mystery of how to live together on a single, finite planet was only just beginning. As the final part of this journey concludes, we are left with a haunting image of the 16th century sailor, standing on the deck of a ship that has seen too much blood and too much salt. He looks back at the receding shore of a century that changed everything. The Age of Discovery was a period of magnificent courage and unspeakable cruelty, of brilliant light and absolute darkness. It proved that man could conquer the sea, but it also revealed that man could not yet conquer his own hunger for power. The wooden ships eventually rotted away, and the gold was spent, but the world they created, a world of global connection, systemic inequality, and restless ambition, is the world we still inhabit today. The 16th century did not just find a new world. It forged the modern soul in the fires of the unknown, leaving us with a history that is as beautiful as it is broken.